The color pie is probably the single most important piece of what makes Magic, Magic. Depending on what colors you choose to play, you can have an entirely different experience with the game, but more importantly, this choice also tells everyone else at the table all they need to know about you as a person. So, let's talk color pie, iconic cards, and why people hate you for playing blue. Magic has 5 primary colors, 10 color pairs, 10 3-color combinations called shards and wedges, 5 4-color combinations, all of the colors, and of course, none of the colors. Meaning immediately you have 32 different ways that you can play this game, and because of that, what you actually choose to play says more about you than any personality test ever will. And that is before you get into the subsections and different commanders within those colors. That said, it is important to know that while the general idea for these colors and their philosophies has just about always been there, over time they have changed a little bit, evolved, and been honed in on to what they were supposed to be. So, there will always be exceptions to just about every rule. Magic's been going on for 3 decades after all. But if we're gonna start talking about the color pie, we might as well start with white. White is all about peace through structure, representing order, law, and community. Of all the colors in the game, white is the most rigid in its philosophy and playstyle. At its worst, this can mean that white decks can be a little bit less creative, innovative, or intricate than others. But it does lean into them having some of the best control tools in the game. Specifically, white is about controlling the board. They are pretty much the color when it comes to exiling threats and ensuring that they don't come back. They can use enchantments to set laws in place that dictate the pace of the game, and they have powerful board wipes that can allow them to come back from seemingly unwinnable situations. When all else fails though, the best defense is a good offense, and when it comes to combat tricks and battle-oriented keywords, white is amazing. White excels at spamming out creatures and tokens, while often having tools like First and Double Strike, Exalted, Flying, Lifelink, and probably most iconically, Vigilance, which together allow them to take control of the battlefield. And if their creatures aren't enough, white tends to heal, prevent damage, and just generally protect things really well. White players love playing for the board more than anything. They are the champions of control and tempo, living by the mentality that if you take the lead, then you can force the opponent to play the game on your terms. But white players sometimes like to bonk things really hard or create untouchable raid bosses as well, and this is where equipment and auras come into play. And finally, when it's time to actually end the game, white turns to Acts of God. Massively flashy Hail Mary plays that seem to come out of nowhere to give a finishing blow against your opponent. But that's what white does well. Where do they struggle? Well, in general, they're kind of a jack-of-all-trades, master of none. While it's pretty normal for there to be some overlap between the colors, white's identity can often feel the most overwhelmed by others. Even if we only look at green, it makes tokens, it removes enchantments, it gains life. Then there's blue that has flyers and control. Red can do aggro way better. Black can clear creatures and manipulate life as well. All white really has over the others is exiling and general board wipes, and that can make it feel a bit lackluster. And that isn't to say that white decks are bad by any means. Although, I'm also not saying white decks aren't bad, but their rigidity can really make them feel less unique and innovative than other options. But maybe you're just here for the aesthetic. White creatures often fall into military, religious, or mythical categories. Things like soldiers, angels, archons, spirits, and pegasi. And then there's tribes that have a sense of hierarchy, things like vampires or thralls, which can often fit into white's umbrella as well. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at some of white's most iconic cards, and some of my personal favorite white commanders. Some of the most common cards you'll see in white often deal with removal, taxes, and protection. Swords to Plowshare, Path of Exile, Farewell, and Stroke of Midnight give you cheap and easy ways to remove targets from the board. Smothering Tithe, Esper Sentinel, Ghostly Prison, Blind Obedience, and Land Tax all force your opponent to play more conservatively to avoid falling too far behind you. And then there's cards like Teferi's Protection, Akroma's Will, Avacyn, and Unbreakable Formation that protect your board from your opponents. But some of my personal favorite white commanders include Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. She is really fun. She can lead to some crazy enter the battlefield combos that just completely pop off. And absolutely, she makes me a bit of a bad person, but it is what it is. Or you can go with something like Celestine the Living Saint that turns life gain into a mechanic that actually does something for once, which is kind of nice. On to black. Power through ruthlessness. This is represented by free will, amorality, and ambition. Black is the color with the most potential. The more you're willing to sacrifice, the more you're able to develop. And in best cases, it can allow you to snowball completely out of control. A fantastic example of Black's core philosophy is a card like Duress. For 1 mana, you can look at your opponent's hand and force them to discard a non-creature, non-land card. This is a simple card that has several layers to it. On paper, you're going to be going 1-for-1, trading your Duress for a card in your opponent's hand. But the first thing you might realize, though, is that your opponent might only have lands and creatures in their hand, which means you might be wasting a card and a mana for nothing. Rather than that guaranteed 1-for-1, there's an inherent risk to this card. But this card also gives you information about your opponent's cards, possibly giving you the ability to predict their next 2 or even 3 turns. Then you have the potential of actually removing important pieces of their strategy. These can be hugely impactful details, but you'll never get the payoff if you're too afraid to take the chance that's inherent to the card. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, and this is the essence of how Black works. In general, Black specializes in individual creature destruction, conditional board wipes, weakening effects, discard, life manipulation, and reanimation. And it also has keywords like lifelink, menace, and death touch. Where Black will struggle is in dealing with non-living threats, things like artifacts or enchantments. You can't exactly kill what's not alive after all. On top of that, Black cards would have you trading your life, cards in hand, your creatures, your firstborn son, anything they can for advantage. And it's important that you're willing to make that sacrifice, but that doesn't mean you can always make that sacrifice. Yes, these are all resources, but if you give too much, eventually you're gonna have nothing left and you can leave yourself completely screwed. As for their creatures, Black gets demons, horrors, anything that you might see in a Spirit Halloween store. While White's humans tended to be soldiers, Black instead has assassins, ninjas, and mercenaries. But let's look at some of their popular and powerful cards. The first category are cards that trade one resource for another. Black has the most tutor cards in the game. These will trade mana to search for your deck for specific cards. Dark Ritual basically says you start with 1 less card in your hand, but your turn 1 is gonna go crazy. Victimize sacrifices 1 creature to revive 2 others, and Phyrexian Arena steals 1 health from you every turn in exchange for giving you 1 extra card draw. In terms of removal, Black rarely exiles things, but they do have some unique options. Firstly, things like Doomblade will destroy any non-black creature. Pretty simple. But if you want a full board wipe, you're probably going to have to lose something for it. Damnation, for example, destroys all creatures on the board, yours included. And then there's the problem of indestructible creatures. How does Black get through that if they can't exile? Well, don't worry. Black themes also include illnesses and curses, so something like Defile will lower a creature's stats until they just fade away. Finally, one of my favorite Black mechanics is forcing your opponent to sacrifice their permanents. If we look at my boy Phyrexian Obliterator, anytime it takes damage, whoever dealt that damage needs to sacrifice that many permanents. And if you're playing against a red deck and get him out, it's pretty much over for them. As for my favorite Black commanders, my brother runs a Kirk Son of Yawgmoth deck, and that can go insane. As it turns out, mana cheating and paying life instead of mana lets you do some pretty powerful stuff. I myself like Massacre Girl, Known Killer. Dealing damage in the form of -1/-1 counters can lead to some really frustrating choices for your opponents, and a commander with a built-in draw engine is always really powerful as well. Next up is a color that is either loved or hated depending on how you play the game. Or rather, if you get to play the game. Blue is perfection through knowledge, represented in logic, technology, insight, and strategy. The better you can plan ahead and outthink your opponents, the easier it is to control the game. Blue is the color of just saying no, with its most iconic card probably being Counterspell. The general idea for Blue's game plan is to counter the large or important spells an opponent is trying to cast, all while manipulating the top card of your own library and drawing enough cards to always have answers. Blue's main mechanics are card draw, counterspell, stealing cards, mill, bouncing, scrying, and taking extra turns. And it has keywords like flash, flying, and hexproof. Also, while all colors work with artifacts to some level, Blue is kind of the artifact color with more synergies than any other by a mile. In Blue's most simple state, you might have a deck revolving around something like Haughty Djinn. This card gains power for each instant and sorcery in your grave, meaning you are suddenly rewarded for countering spells and bouncing cards back to your opponent's hand. You've stalled out to the point where you can drop this big 10-4 flyer, and your opponent will need to find an answer immediately or they lose. But even then, you can always just counter that answer, right? Blue is also interesting in that it can play with mill. This is really the only color where an alternative win condition is built into its themes. It can be a very powerful color in general, but you're probably not going to be making too many friends by telling other people they can't play the game. And especially in Commander, countering big fun spells probably puts a bit of a target on your head. On top of that, it's much harder to control 3 other players than it is just 1. Speaking of, this all seems like good stuff so far, right? So where does Blue struggle? The first big gap in Blue's game plan is finding permanent solutions. Sure, it can be hard for an opponent to actually get a card to hit the field, but once they do stick something, Blue becomes very limited. You can bounce it back to hand, but they'll just play it again. Blue very rarely has exile or destruction effects, which means unless you get another counterspell, that threat is just gonna come back. And that doesn't just mean creatures either. Blue's also not great at dealing with artifacts or enchantments. They can also struggle against early aggression. Remember, typically the best case scenario is that you're countering with counterspell for 2 mana. And ideally, you are dealing with your opponent's spells that cost 2 or more mana so that you gain some tempo or advantage. But what happens when you run into a white weenie deck or a red rush deck where they just keep spamming 1-drops? Suddenly your 2 mana counterspell is going to put you pretty far behind very quickly. And once that happens, you don't really have effective ways of clearing up the board to save yourself. That said, these are all very solvable problems in other colors, which in my opinion makes Blue the color that benefits the most from being combined with another. Blue's big creature type is Merfolk, but they also have things like Sphinxes and Djinn, and then they have anything that has to do with magic or things that belong in the ocean. On top of that, illusions and shapeshifters are often blue as well. As for Blue's humans, they tend to be things like artificers, pirates, and wizards. So, let's talk about their iconic cards. We've discussed Counterspell, but there's about 1 million versions of it to fit in each specific situation. When it comes to card draw, you have tools like Rhystic Study, Brainstorm, and Windfall, which quickly give you access to your deck, with cards like Ponder allowing you to manipulate the top of your deck and select the cards that you want to draw. On top of that, you can push this to the extreme and run cards like Thassa's Oracle, which essentially wins you the game by decking yourself out. As for Blue commanders, Lear, Disciple of the Drowned, gives your instants and sorceries flashback at the expense of turning off counterspells. It's a really unique card that gives you a lot more bang for your buck, but forces Blue to play in a very different way. Or maybe try out Cosima and the Omen Keel. This is a vehicle-based deck that gives you a ton of card draw and can actually steal your opponent's lands when you hit them, letting you run away with the game pretty quickly. On to red, the color of freedom through action, represented through impulse, aggression, and burn. If blue is about patience and planning, red is about acting instinctively. Red's idea of defense is that if you kill the other player, they can't hurt you anymore. It's the ultimate double-edged sword of a color that blows its load immediately in hopes of winning the game and starting another one right away. After all, why play 1 game of Magic when you could play 5 instead? I think the best example of the red mindset is to look at the impulse draw mechanic that they've been seeing more and more over recent years. Rather than traditional draw, red exiles the top card of their deck and then has access to that until the next turn's end phase. This might be a scary thought to some players, but remember, the idea is that red wants to win now, so 1 extra turn should be all you need anyways. It turns the deck into a lit fuse and a race to kill the opponent before it self-destructs. Like white, red also has a focus on combat, but while white tries to protect and develop their creatures, red tends to have a bit more of a Zap Brannigan approach.
Knowing their weakness, I sent wave after wave of my own men at them until they reached their limit and shut down.
To help with this, red is the main haste color, allowing you to get in for damage right away. Many of its cards also can sacrifice themselves to deal damage to the opponent, in contrast to black, who would sacrifice their creatures for draw or recursion effects. Now, you take that, you add in some flyers, some first strikers, and just a splash of menace and trample, and you get some really effective beatdown strategies. The name of Red's game is strictly damage, and to that extent, plenty of their spells will burn your opponent's life, which can add in just that last bit of damage that you need to rush them down. So, where do they fall short? Well, the longer the game goes, the easier it is for your opponents to catch up from the aggressive lead you took. And once they start dropping 4, 5, 6, and 7 mana spells, your swarm of 1, 2, and 3 drops starts falling behind pretty quickly. Basically, red turns up the heat at the start of the game, and then ends up running out of steam. On top of this, red's idea of removal is damage. So rather than saying destroy target creature, red spells tend to say deal X damage, making removing a bigger threat kinda difficult, let alone a threat that has indestructible. That said, red can destroy artifacts, but enchantments are usually safe. You can break a physical thing, you can't break a magical thing. Now, let's look at some of red's cards to get a better idea of how they play. I think the most iconic red card of all time is probably Lightning Bolt, a 1-mana card that hits any target for 3 damage. It can be a ton of tempo, allowing you to remove a 2 or even 3 drop at value, or, and hear me out, you can point it face and do more damage. Pretty tempting. Even their board clears are just big AoE damage spells. Look at Blasphemous Act, a 9-cost sorcery that does 13 damage to all creatures, but which also gets a discount for each creature on the field. We've talked about impulse drawing, but if we look at other ways that red draws cards, we also have things like Faithless Looting, which at first is effectively a discard 3 to draw 2, but which has flashback so that you can fix your hand again in the future. It doesn't matter if you go negative, we just want to make sure that we're getting access to our fast cards quickly so that we can overrun our opponents. On the higher end of things, we might have something like Atali Primal Storm, which can exile each player's top card when it attacks, and then let you cast those cards without paying their mana cost. It adds a bit of chaos to the idea of card advantage in a way that red really likes. Finally, we have what is arguably the most important thing for red, its creatures. While most of them are just going to run the opponent down, plenty of red's cards have a lot of synergy in them actually. Things like Guttersnipe burning your opponent every time you cast an instant or sorcery. And then you have cards like Phoenix Chick, which will reward you by attacking aggressively and give you a chance to resummon it from the grave. In terms of red commanders, Krenko is a classic. He literally just spits out a never-ending swarm of goblins that can rush down your opponents. Or you could choose to be an absolute bastard, ruin everyone's time, and play Zozu the Punisher, who burns players every time they put a land down. If you want to make enemies at the table, I can recommend playing him. And finally, we have green, growth through acceptance. This is represented through interdependence, development, and creation. Green isn't about changing your cards, it's about taking what makes them good and making that part of them better. At its most simple, green wants to embrace nature by playing as many lands as they can, as quickly as they can, and then dropping a big ol' meatball of stats. This is the main color for ramp, a mechanic literally named after rampant growth. Green is more than willing to sacrifice some tempo in the early game to have faster access to their large creatures. For example, let's say turn 1, you play a Llanowar elf. Turn 2, a rampant growth, and another elf. Turn 3 is a cultivate and another rampant growth. And suddenly on turn 4, you have access to 9 mana, which is crazy. Would that be the nut hand? Absolutely, but it happens. On top of that, green just kinda does a bit of everything. It has ramp, it has healing, artifact and enchantment destruction, trample, reach, vigilance, hexproof, death touch, token generation, single and multiple target buffs, conditional card draw, fight cards, regeneration, and even land destruction if you're a bad person. It is easily the most well-rounded color because of the massive swath of options that it has. And that is green's secret sauce. They don't do much until they do everything at once. But because they take time to develop, green players get a reputation of being chill and fair. No one picks on the guy with an empty board in Commander, right? And then boom, they drop Ghalta on turn 5, and it's GG before you even know how to react. That said, green isn't perfect. It tends to remove flying creatures rather than having its own. It tends to build towards their big plays early in exchange for having very weak opening turns, and their huge investment into singular creatures can make them very vulnerable to spot removal. On top of that, if green wants to remove a creature, they tend to need to do it with their own creatures, which can be an issue. Speaking of their creatures, green has elves, treefolk, spiders, worms, and all form of animals and nature spirits. But most importantly, they have squirrels. So, let's talk green's big cards. Now, we've already mentioned Rampant Growth, but there are about as many ramp cards in green as there are counterspells in blue, with such unique diverseness as Cultivate, which plays a basic land from your deck and adds another one to hand, or Kodama's Reach, which plays a basic land from your deck and adds another to your hand. Ooh. Or there's the many 4-mana variations that play 2 lands from your deck onto your field. Okay, maybe those aren't the most unique, but they have diversity in cards like Llanowar Elves, Fyndhorn Elves, Elvish Mystics, Arbor Elves, and a bunch of other cards, which are effectively 1-mana 1/1s, which add a green mana. Okay, being serious though, for many of green's ramp cards, there's a second or even third card that does almost or exactly the same thing. And this redundancy might seem weird at first, but it offers a lot of consistency to their decks, especially in a singleton format like Commander. And all that mana can lead to game enders like Craterhoof Behemoth, Old Gnawbone, or Ghalta, with cards like Pounce, which allows you to force those big meatball creatures into fights with your opponent's creatures. And I'll let you know this for free, they're probably gonna win those fights. Green also has quite a few modal cards which add flexibility to their game plan. Return to Nature lets you destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or exile a card from the graveyard. And plenty of their destruction cards have options like this that make green feel like a very adaptable and almost living color. In this way, green is both the color of flexibility and adaptability, which can make it effective in just about any situation. As for my pick for green commanders, there are plenty to choose from, but I mean, if I'm gonna be going with mono green, I'm either gonna go very wide or very tall. Elves under Marwyn the Nurturer can generate a ton of value, while also setting up a pretty resilient board. But my preference is definitely Gargo's Vicious Watcher. He lets you cast huge hydras at a discount, while also acting as spot removal by fighting whenever one of your creatures is targeted by a spell. And that's just kinda silly and fun. Now, the last of the singular colors, if you can call it that, is actually a lack of color, that being colorless. By definition, colorless doesn't have to fit into the color pie. They have access to just about any ability or keyword without breaking any boundaries. But in general though, colorless decks tend to fall into 2 camps. You're either playing an artifact deck or an Eldrazi deck. Artifacts usually build synergies within themselves. For example, many of them have affinity for artifacts, which allows your deck to snowball once it gets going. They have keywords like Metalcraft, which can make cards like Etched Champion stronger if you have 3 artifacts on the field. But being real though, if you're playing pure artifacts, you're almost always better off just going blue artifacts, at least in most situations. When it comes to Eldrazi, they're almost similar to green and black in a lot of ways. They create tokens that can be sacrificed for mana, and their end goal is to summon the massive game-ending titans. I actually uploaded another video today on the lore and history of the Eldrazi, where I break down their story in depth, as well as talk about them on a more mechanical level. So be sure to check that one out after this one if you're interested. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, colorless is great because it isn't really limited to any specific rule, but that also means it isn't allowed to thrive in many specific areas either. Most times, you want to splash in other colors to make the most of your game plan if you can. For my colorless commander picks, I definitely gotta recommend Sir Ginger. No real reason, he's just a silly little guy, and I think that's more than enough. Or, if you're looking on the Eldrazi side, Zul'Adok is probably still the best option. He basically makes your big guys summon other big guys, which can get out of control pretty quickly. Now, with those out of the way, we can jump into color factions. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these as it would be largely repeating myself. Blue is always going to blue regardless of what you add to it, right? Instead, I'm going to be talking about what their combined specialties are and what weaknesses they help each other cover. And of course, I'll give a commander recommendation for each as well. Azorius is white and blue, and it's probably the single best color pair when it comes to stalling out a game and pure control. White adds a lot of the removal that blue was lacking, while blue offers card draw and even more protection to white, making it a very difficult combination to really deal with. That said, they don't do anything. Azorius can really struggle to end the game, so you kinda just gridlock things and you end up taking an hour for one match. If I'm going Azorius though, I'm probably going Vehicles with Shorikai, Group Hug with Quain, or the Ultimate Freeze deck with Hilda. If you want to guarantee your opponents don't have fun, definitely check out Hilda. White and Black, Orzhov, was my first love in Magic the Gathering. If Azorius is the ultimate stall control combo, then Orzhov is the ultimate field control combo. Black cards supply the advantage, draw, and destruction, while white gives you healing, exile, and powerful enchantments to turn the tide of battle. There are very few creatures that Orzhov won't be able to give an answer for, and in turn, their creatures tend to have a great bit of keyword soup to take control of the board. Not to mention, they can always be brought back to the field if they are dealt with. I really do like the comparison to Azorius, where Azorius deals with things before they touch the field, and Orzhov deals with things on the field. However, Orzhov tends to have a built-in win condition of some kind, slowly taking away and draining your opponent's life, which adds at least some kind of clock to the game. Again, this combo is great, but it can be very mana intensive, and tends to be less active and more reactive. They deal with threats first, and they create threats second. Some fun commanders for Orzhov are Teysa Karlov, who doubles death triggers and gives your tokens Vigilance and Lifelink. Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, who doesn't have to deal with commander tax, and instead taxes every player every time they play a card. Or you can go with Arrietty the Charmed Apple, who is the queen of aura enchantments, draining your opponent's health while not allowing them to attack you. Red and white gets you Boros, a color with all the aggro and offensive potential in the world, which in Commander just kinda gets dunked on. This combination isn't bad, but its problem is that it's not really functional in a format where you have 3 health pools of 40 to get through. 120 health is just a lot. On top of that, if you are playing very aggressively and developing a board in the early stages of Commander, you are absolutely the threat and you're going to be targeted. And because of that, you have all these powerful tools, but you're not really able to use them effectively. The long and short of it is that Boros has all the aggro tools that Red has to offer in combination with the combat tricks, protection, and board buffing enchantments that come from White, but they just really struggle with card draw, and they run out of steam way too fast for Commander. My favorite Boros commander is easily Nahiri Forged in Fury. This is an all-out aggro deck that makes the most out of equipment for some devastating advantage, with Nahiri also adding in a splash of pseudo card draw to help get things rolling. Also, in that Eldrazi video I mentioned earlier, you kinda get the story of Nahiri, so if you're wondering about her, you can go learn her lore there. Looking away from aggro, we have green and white, making Selesnya. This is a really well-rounded mix that allows for going wide and buffing up the board, all while keeping your field safe. On top of that, green and white is a great base for an enchantment deck and for ramp lists. Regardless of what your focus in Selesnya, you're almost always going to be spamming that theme as much as you can, as fast as you can. It's basically a synergy supercharger, and you're gonna have a lot of fun playing it. My personal favorite Selesnya commander is Karametra, literally the god ramp deck. My list has basically pulled every land out of the deck over 4 or 5 turns, and then it's just all gas from there. Or you could go with something like a Sithis build, which is entirely around enchantments. She's a very low-cost commander who gives you access to life gain and card draw. The deck literally fuels itself. On to the best pair in the game. Dimir is black and blue, and obviously I am not biased. Black and blue has nearly the same mix of on-board and on-stack removal that Azorius had, but with black in their pool, it adds a lot more aggressive tools that can help you push for advantage and close out a game. Importantly though, this is also the ultimate mill combo. It has the tools to protect yourself while you work on whittling away your opponent's deck. Umbrus is the first Dimir commander I would recommend. He allows you to exile cards from the top of your opponent's library until they hit a land, every time you play a horror or nightmare card. If you're lucky, that can go pretty crazy. If you're me, you're gonna mill one card at a time pretty often. That said though, Umbrus himself also gets +1/+1 for every exiled card that opponents have, which scales very quickly. I actually have a list for an Umbrus Eldrazi deck over on Patreon right now. It focuses on all the smaller Eldrazi with Ingest, and it's very fun. So if you're interested, check out the Patreon. The second Dimir commander is my personal favorite commander that I have ever played with, Jon Irenicus. Jon does this magic trick where he turns all of the objectively worst cards in Magic the Gathering into absolute gold. Basically, once a turn, you can send one of your creatures from your field to someone else as a gift. And that gift comes with +2/+2, and it is goated, which means it has to attack every turn, but it can't swing your way. But that's not all, you get to draw every time that card attacks. Do you know how bad some of the cards in Magic are? The absolute garbage that you can give people leads to some of the funniest games I have ever played. If you're into a bit of a slower deck that just watches chaos unfold, please build Jon Irenicus. It is so goddamn funny. Another very fun combo is Simic with green and blue. All the control and draw of blue mixed with the ramp and big beasts of green. Basically, it is a massive resource generator. This is one of the pairs that really does a lot to cover each other's weaknesses, but most importantly, it really allows for some fun and unique game plans. A very cool commander to try out is Ivy, Gleeful Spell Thief. Anytime a player casts a spell on one other creature, you can choose to copy that spell and target Ivy with it. This lets you make a Voltron build where you basically pile up auras on one of your creatures, and then Ivy also gets those effects. Voltron decks like this really struggle with individual spot removal. However, Ivy covers that base by giving you a second big creature and all the blue counterspells you might need in order to protect those creatures on the board. Or hey, if you don't want to go the aura enchantment route, just accumulate a bunch of battle chicks in your hand with all the card draw, cast them all at once with all the mana you've set up, and for double the effect, it's almost a guaranteed OTK. You can also go Merfolk Tribal with Hawkball, but Ivy's right there. Merfolk is okay too, though. Now, probably one of the most iconic color pairings is blue and red making Izzet. This combo is all about spell slinging. You draw a bunch of cards to keep casting instants and sorceries, and pump up creatures with prowess or to activate trigger effects. This is the combo pair, and you can perform some really crazy things in the game when you have access to both blue and red. That said, it can be kind of hard to get creatures on the board when you have such a focus on instants and sorceries. The classic Izzet commander is Niv Mizzet Parun. It can't be countered, it pings for 1 when you draw, and you draw anytime anyone casts an instant or sorcery. You become a ping machine with this dude out, and if you're running against an aggro or token deck, you can just start clearing their horde every time they start to make it. Another deck I've been having a lot of fun with is Eris Roar of the Storms. It's a pretty expensive commander, but you can get discounts for each unique mana cost among instants and sorceries in the grave. But once she comes out, your second spell each turn nets you a 4/4 dragon with flying and prowess, and that ability can end the game almost immediately. Black and green together is Golgari. We talked about how both black and green are very well-rounded colors, and together they basically shore up any weakness the other has. Their big focuses are on Death Touch, tokens, and recursions. Your creatures tend to trade for your opponents, but then yours come back and theirs stay dead. I personally like a token deck around Chatterfang because squirrels. This commander basically says anytime you make any token, you can also make that many squirrels. And then you can sacrifice squirrels to give a creature +X/-X to act as a finisher or as removal. Or, and hear me out, we go Yargle and Multani, and we simply swing for game. Do they sometimes have an answer? Absolutely. Of course they do. But sometimes they don't. And that's the high you'll be chasing for the rest of your life. On the other hand, we have Rakdos, black and red. While red definitely benefits from adding black to the mix, it's hard to say that black benefits from having red. Remember how we talked about black being a high-risk, high-reward color? Well, adding more chaos to that can high-roll into some very powerful aggro, but more likely it'll blow up in your face and leave you without any resources really quickly. A really fun way to mitigate this problem is by forcing your opponents to attack each other, which you can do by having Carter Doomscourge as your commander. When he enters the battlefield, you goad every creature your opponents control, which can effectively act as a board wipe, or it can leave your opponents with nothing to block your next attack. Add in a bit of recursion and try and kill him every turn, and suddenly you're forcing your opponents to swing all out every turn, and that's just kinda funny. You take all of the strategy out of Magic, and that's kinda what Rakdos likes to do. Or if you just want to blow your opponents out of the water, you can play Rowan, Scion of War. But honestly, I think he's too powerful for my style of play. Rowan basically says your spells are cheaper based on how much life you lost this turn, which can enable some crazy combos. It turns out that burning 10 health and then casting Torment of Hailfire for 2 as if X was 10 is pretty good. I'm typically not a fan of this very powerful playstyle. I like lower power Magic, but I definitely understand why people would like this. And finally, for the 2 color pairs, we have red and green Gruul. This has the offensive red backed up by a real endgame. Why rush people down with 1/1s and 2/2s when you can drop 5/5s or bigger? That said, Gruul doesn't have much real interaction. It has some damage spells, some fight spells, but not really any destroy or exile abilities when it comes to creatures. It's just an Unga Boonga deck. Admittedly, this is the pair that I'm least experienced with, but if I was going to build a deck for it, I think I would try work around Halana and Elena. I really like +1 counter decks and extra combat effects, so these two seem like they could make for some pretty explosive turns that would be a lot of fun. Like I said, I don't really play Gruul that much. Let me know if there's some kind of commander you think I should check out in these colors. On to the 3 color combinations with shards and wedges. Shards are colors which are adjacent on the wheel, allied colors, while a wedge is 1 color pair with its opposite side of the wheel, enemy colors. Whichever the case, the center color tends to take priority. So for example, Esper is the combination of white, blue, and black with a focus on blue. This combo is more or less a perfect control setup, with access to exile, destruction, counters, board wipes, -1/-1 counters. You can bounce cards, you have card draw, there's recursion, and really anything else you might want. That said, we still have the issue of this being a very mana-intensive color combination, which can become an issue and slow this deck down a bit, especially if you're trying to conserve your mana on your turn so that you have answers on your opponents. An Esper commander that I really like is Tivit, Seller of Secrets. This is a 6 mana 6/6 with flying and ward 3, which makes him an immediate threat that's kind of difficult to deal with. And that's before all of your counterspells and white cards get involved. Add on to that Tivit forces votes, which can generate clues and treasures, and you suddenly have these great resources to fuel your engine as you hold control over the game. Black, blue, and red together is Grixis, with a focus on black. This combo takes all the strengths of Dimir and splashes in some direct damage to finish out the game. It's just a very well-balanced combination, however, it can struggle against faster decks. That said, you get some of the most interesting and unique commanders in Grixis. My personal favorite is Marchesa the Black Rose. Marchesa gives your field Dethrone, which adds a +1 counter every time your creatures attack the highest health player, and that really promotes faster gameplay, which I like. But she also makes it so that if a creature dies with a +1 counter on it, it is returned to the field in the end step, which can be some of the most insane recursion I've ever seen. Not to mention, that works on herself. So if you can get a +1 counter on her, when she dies, she will simply return. So play some aristocrat cards that allow you to sacrifice things at instant speed, and suddenly you have a commander that is almost never killable. I like to play her in an artifact-focused deck, specifically filled with modular creatures that die, pass on their counters to another artifact, and then come back with more counters at the end of the turn. You basically hoard these until you can drop Triskelion and OTK one of your opponents. I think it's probably one of my decks that's the most difficult to deal with. Over in Jund, we are adding green and black to red. This is the Aristocrat Dream combo. Adding the stability of green to the extremely high risk of Rakdos balances things out in a really effective way. It's a great combination of aggro, removal, and recursion that just feels great to play. The only downside is that you really need to hit your card draw engines, or things can kinda get jammed up pretty quickly. But you can mitigate that by playing Korvold, Fey-Cursed King, as your commander. This is a 4/4 flyer who gets +1/+1 and draws you a card every time you sacrifice a permanent. Suddenly, you are double dipping on those sack effects, and that card draw fuels everything to keep it going smoothly. Where Rakdos really struggled to keep any cards in hand, Korvold can sometimes run into the problem of overdrawing, which is honestly not a bad problem to have. Naya adds white and red to green, and this is all about nature and aggressive synergy. The whole idea of Naya is to flood the board with powerful creatures and then buff them up to overwhelm your opponent. Now, listen to me, I don't make the rules, but if you are playing Naya, you are legally obligated to either be playing cats and dogs or dinosaurs. All other lists are illegal. That's just how it is, I'm sorry. I personally like Pantlaza, which discovers X the first time you play a dinosaur each turn, based on their toughness. Naya can snowball like crazy once they get going, and adding in this discovery effect can really get things moving much faster. Bant adds green and blue to white. It's all ramp and card draw to get to those massive finishers once your board has been established. This is a resource stockpiler, but really struggles with early game aggro, and it needs time to set up. I would definitely recommend Bernard Ginger Sculptor. He gives all food creatures +2/+2 and trample, and turns any non-token creature that dies on your field into a 1/1 food golem. From there, you splash in some golem synergy, a couple of token multipliers, which you get from white and green, as well as a couple powerful ETB or death triggers, and suddenly you just have this synergy machine of a deck. It's super fun if you haven't tried it. Abzan mixes white and green into black. This combination focuses on recursion, life manipulation, and graveyard synergy. This can still be a bit of a slower list, but once your grave is set up, you can really make some powerful plays that can be hard to fully deal with. My favorite Abzan commander is Nethroi, Apex of Death, and I know this card says mutate on it, but we aren't really going to be playing a mutate deck with it. Instead, we're focusing on the second ability. Whenever Nethroi does mutate, you can revive any number of creatures with a total of 10 or less power from your graveyard. So, we are simply filling the library with tiny dudes that have powerful effects, and then we bring back 5 or 10 or even more of them all at once if you can get creatures with 0 attack. It takes some setup, but this card can go crazy. On to Jeskai, adding white and blue to red. This combination has a great mix of control, tempo, and direct damage while controlling the board with low-cost minions. Remember how I said that Boros runs out of steam? Well, adding blue's card draw really helps with that. Now, if you're playing Jeskai, you could play Narset and get 1,000,000,000,000 extra turns, or, and hear me out on this, you could be a good person. Try Hinata, Dawncrowned. This is a 4-mana 4/4 with flying and trample, and it gives your spells a 1-mana discount for each of their targets. Meanwhile, it has the opposite effect, increasing your opponent's spells for each target. This is such a fun spellslinger deck and can really make the most out of a lot of X-cost spells, all while effectively giving Ward 1 to everything on the board that you're not targeting. Sultai is green with the addition of black and blue. This combo has a ton of recursion with plenty of excellent control and draw tools. In general, this tends to be the graveyard deck. You're going to fill it up as fast as you can and then pull out all of your best cards for a massive discount. And all you gotta do is simply pray that no one has Bojuka Bog. The new Mothman Commander is a really fun mill-like deck around rad counters, and if you haven't tried them, Nine Finger Keen can be a really cool gate-based deck. But it's hard to beat the classics, and Muldrotha is just so consistently solid. Yeah, she's a bit on the expensive side, but you're playing green, it's not that bad. And once you do get her out, once a turn you can play a land and cast a permanent of each type from your graveyard. Unless your opponent is exiling all of your cards, Muldrotha will make sure you always have options and enough mana to pay for them by bringing back lands. Mardu adds red and black to white. This is the color of vampires, aggression, removal, and resilience. They will swarm you down and then bring their creatures back once you finally do remove them. In general, Mardu also just has some of the most fun and unique commanders in the game. Ishin doubles battle triggers, which can be super crazy. Mr. House abuses the fact that a D&D set was released to make a bunch of tokens. Edgar Markov gets you kicked out of your playgroup, and they also have Megatron. But one of my favorites is Kelsian the Plague. This is a 2/2 for 3 mana that has Vigilance and Haste. He also gets +1/+1 for each experience counter you have, with an additional ability to tap him to hit any opponent's creature for 1 damage, then gaining an experience counter if that creature dies this turn. The goal is basically to give Kelsian Death Touch, untap him a bunch of times, and to protect him as long as you can. And when they finally kill him, just revive him. This is a super toxic and very fun deck that kills any card your opponent plays at instant speed for no mana. And our last 3-color combo is Temur, adding red and green to blue. That said, it might be Temur, I don't know, this is another one of the colors I don't play very often. The name of the game in this combo though is Big Boys Hitting Hard. You don't get a ton of removal, but if you can survive, you will eventually run over the enemy. You could go for Animar for protection from white and black and super cheap Eldrazi's, or you can go with Mirim for some of the most disgusting dragon combos in the game. The amount of times that I have been one shot from full health because of this bastard card is so frustrating. But regardless of how you build this list, you're just gonna run people down in the end, and I think that's kind of beautiful. As we enter the 4 and 5 color combinations, we hit a bit of an issue. You don't really need a color identity for these combinations, because in most cases, they can do anything. Remember, colors close to each other on the wheel tend to have similar abilities or overlap. So if we are hitting 4 of the 5 colors, we have the option to do just about whatever we want to. Now, maybe you'll miss out on hyper-specific things like blue's counterspell if you don't have it, but even in cases like that, there are other counterspells in different colors that exist. And because of that, in general, you just end up with a pile of good stuff. These combos don't really even have official or community official names in the way that 2 or 3 pair factions do, because you might as well just say I'm not playing white. That said, we do have the Nephilim from Ravnica, which some people use as titles for them, and I'm a big fan of the Nephilim, so I'm gonna use them anyways. Those titles would be Yor for no green, Glint for no white, Dune for no blue, Ink for no black, and Witch for no red. As for 5 colors, that's either just called 5 colors, or it's called Wooburg for short. Typically, if you're reaching 4 or 5 colors, you're just trying to do something very stupid, very powerful, or very specific, most of which will earn you some hate. The Ur-Dragon, Joda, Shrines, Urtet, Slivers, Cody. If you're going 5 colors, you're probably doing something obnoxious, and very rarely are they fun to play against. That said, they can be very fun to play as. So depending on how much of a supervillain you want to be, grab a deck and try it out. But that covers all 32 color combinations, what they do well, where they struggle, and some fun commanders that you can try for them. Let me know what your favorite faction is and what commanders you like to use in it. If you enjoyed, remember to leave a like and subscribe, and if you want to support the channel to help me get more content out like this, be sure to check out my Patreon. I have a video on there interviewing Mark Rosewater about the creation of the Ravnica block, and as I mentioned, I have an Eldrazi mill deck list on there as well, which if you're interested is very fun to play. But with that said, I am officially out of mana, so I'm going to end things here, and I will see you all in the next one.